Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Consciousness and Brain Formatting, the next instalment of the extended lockdown webinar series, and I hope you've been enjoying them. So tonight I'm going to talk about consciousness, spirituality, and the neural substrates of consciousness, so understanding how the brain enables you to have a spiritual experience. That's what we're going to look at. And I'm going to talk as well, because we're talking about the brain, I'm going to talk about brain formatting. And I know for some of you it might be something you've heard before, but I'll give a little bit of introduction to formatting and show you how you can access major brain areas and why, sort of relating that to embryology, why accessing those brain areas is important, and why we can, when we access them, we can make profound changes within our state of consciousness. And then I'll look at a little bit of duality and the experience of duality in the brain, talking a little bit about dimethyltryptamine and the difference that makes, and also a model that I propose for the enlightened state, or the state of enlightenment when you're just completely at one, or they call it being in the void, or many different things. So I developed these models of consciousness that we use in NK, and specifically in the Neural Emotional Pathways 3 workshop with the consciousness balance. So anyway, I hope you enjoy it, and I've had a lot of fun reviewing the PowerPoint and adding some things in, and also with my latest understanding of how things work. It's always interesting for me to talk about it at a different time. This talk I did maybe 15, 18 years ago, the first time at a conference, but it's changed a lot since then. So let's start. So consciousness, and what is that? And what is the experience of consciousness? Or you might sort of call it perception as well, but true consciousness is actually a definition of being one with everything. It's actually the experience of enlightenment. But to understand this, first we have to go back down, before we can talk about all those very interesting kind of ideas. What we need to do is come back down and look at the very basics of kinesiology, and especially of the acupressure formatting model that's used in NK and other systems of kinesiology such as LEAP and Applied Physiology. So, like every good system of kinesiology, NK, we have our own triangle. I always say it's, to have a system of kinesiology, you have to have a triangle. It seems to be that everyone has one, but anyway. And this is something I remember I was teaching one day. I can't remember, it was a long time ago. And I was talking about the interconnectedness of our being, both on the energetic structures. And so, with kinesiology, we make interventions through working with the energetic structures, usually through the meridian system or the chakra system. And if you've been doing a lot of these talks that I've been doing lately, you would have actually heard me talk about those in different ways. But that's where kinesiology makes an intervention, like we can hold acupoints, or we can balance a chakra or balance a meridian. It's also connected with our anatomy and physiology, and that's our physical body. Like you might have a pain in your back. Like you can have this experience of physical discomfort, but you don't know where that really comes from. Also over here, we've got the psychology, and in the end I called it psychology, but it's the mental emotional state, archetypes and things like this. So this is about how you feel in the situation. The anatomy and physiology is how it's actually manifesting into the physical body. And if you remember, those of you who've been doing the series, you might remember back to the one about stress and burnout, where I spoke about how emotion manifests into the body. And there's also the connection with the energetic structures. And the energetic structures is where we can actually make a change. And so we get an imbalance in our energy structures. And that's why in kinesiology we say, I give you a balance. Because the idea of kinesiology is that we're going to balance the energy. And what is the energy? It's usually the meridian and chakra system. Can be other things such as nadis, auras, and the figure eight energies and all that. The other thing, so there's two important things that we use in kinesiology, and that were eventually Richard Utt came with the idea to combine them. The first one is finger modes, and these are some of the modes. We call them modes in kinesiology, but in fact they're mudras. And what's interesting about mudras is they've been used for thousands of years in India. I mean, they know that. And not just India too. I mean, you know, when I've been in Europe and you go into all these old churches, I remember going in one in Kiev, and you're looking at these really old paintings in a famous church, and you've got all these saints and even pictures of Jesus holding mudras. And so the idea of using mudras has been around for a very long time in many different traditions. And in fact, what they do is they represent a manifestation of a yoga asana. And yoga asanas, what they do is they affect your chakra nadi system. So when we hold a mudra, we're actually accessing the chakra nadi system. And then what happens is that if you test a muscle test, what happens when you test a muscle test is you're assessing the level of stress. So the use of mudras tells you if there's stress in the chakra nadi system. So this is the mudra we use for glands, and that's the one for anatomy. And then we use acupoints as well, and the acupoints have been used in the traditional Chinese medicine for a long time through acupuncture and other systems. And they have a whole thing, you know, about the five element theory and all that. And, you know, I've spoken about that at length in various webinars, talks, and in all the courses that I've written. And so what we did in kinesiology up until Richard Utt came along is we would hold a mudra and then test a muscle, or we'd hold an acupoint or an indicator point, or even a reflex point, which is another thing and has a completely different mechanism. And I'm not going to talk about that. Maybe my next talk, when I talk about primitive reflexes, I can talk about that kind of thing. So what happens is that we would hold an acupoint or a mudra and then test a muscle test. So now what we're doing is that we're finding we can use combinations of the mudras and the acupoints, and then Richard Utt called it formatting. Then everyone came up with formatting. They had a format for this and that, but it wasn't the same thing. So Charles changed it to acupressure formatting. And so that's what we try to call it now, though in Netherlands and Belgium they call it stress formatting, which is probably a more accurate name for it. But, you know, in the end, it's just a name. You know, I've learned to try to let go of these things. So this is what the nadi system looks like, and you can see you've got the three major nadis there of Kundalini, and then all these other thousands of nadis coming out through the aura. The Kundalini here, you can see here is like the twin serpents, it's duality, and it's Ida and Pingala, and it's important to understand that the Ida and Pingala represent duality, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. And it's important because once we're in duality, we're out of enlightenment. And it's kind of interesting how that's represented in different traditions. Another picture, I just really like this picture. Anyone who's done courses with me will have seen it, because it's got the celestial chakras here, it's got major chakras, it's got minor chakras. So, you know, and this is from the 15th century. So in India, they knew about all these different chakras. They just never really wrote much about them, which is kind of curious, but that's the way it is. So that's kind of an overview of the formatting and how it works. But what we really want to know is the brain, and how does the brain actually work with consciousness? That's what we would like to know. So here's a picture of the brain, and it's a good picture. Now you can see it's got the major divisions here. Up here you've got the cerebral cortex and the limbic system's in there. I think they call it the prosencephalon. Here, this red bit's the diencephalon. This is the midbrain or mesencephalon. Here is the pons and cerebellum, the medulla oblongata. All of these three are called the rhombencephalon. And then down here you've got the spinal cord. So they're the major divisions. And like what I'll show you is that they actually come out of neurology. You can see here the prosencephalon, which contains the cortex, limbic system, and diencephalon. The mesencephalon's the midbrain. Here, the rhombencephalon, this will become the medulla, pons, and the cerebellum, which literally just grows out of the pons. And then the spinal cord. And over here you can see it. And I found this other picture, which is really cool. You can see there you've got the telencephalon is, again, now the limbic system and the cortex, diencephalon, mesencephalon, and then down here you've got the rhombencephalon and the spinal cord. This picture here shows you all the major subdivisions. You can see here you've got the cortex and limbic system in here. And interesting, when we think about in kinesiology, when we think about the meridian relationship, and this was a really important thing that came out of applied kinesiology and also Touch for Health, was the meridian relationship of central and governing vessel to the brain. And you don't really find that much in Chinese medicine. When I went back and looked into the depths of Chinese medicine, you know, central vessel was to do with the uterus and the prostate gland. And of course we do that in NK. When we teach people the basics, we teach people central is the to do with the uterus and the prostate gland, but it's also to do with your cerebral cortex and your limbic system. Then down here you've got the brain stem and spinal cord, and the brain stem is really topped off there by the diencephalon, and then you've got the midbrain, pons and cerebellum, medulla, and the spinal cord. So all of these are, I call them the primary areas of the brain, and in our basic workshop of brain formatting, that's what we teach. And here you can see it's another picture. You can really see, this is a photo. You can see the prosencephalon there, which is the cortex, limbic system, and diencephalon. This is just about 4 weeks, and you can see that the fetus is not very well developed, and all this came out of the neural tube. And you can see here the mesencephalon, which is your midbrain, rhombencephalon, which is going to be your medulla, pons, and your cerebellum, and then the spinal cord coming down there. So in kinesiology, as I was saying, you've got, you know, the cortex, or cerebral cortex and limbic system, which are connected to central vessel, and we use the supraspinatus muscle test. Then all these areas, governing vessel, which is, you know, they say a governing vessel is the spinal cord, but it's also the brain stem. And there's also the peripheral nervous system as well, because the peripheral nervous system comes out of the brainstem and the spinal cord, and its neurons are in the brainstem and spinal cord. So whenever we think about governing vessel, you have to include the nerves as well. And I remember at some point when I was working, you know, I've got this introductory course, Brain Formatting, which some of you might know. At some point I added the nerves into it because it wasn't initially in there, because I realised it was actually just as important as everything else. And so you can see here the brain stem, which actually includes the diencephalon, midbrain, pons and medulla, all make the brain stem. Then you've got the spinal cord and the nerves. So if you see back to this picture, here's the spinal cord, but all of this is a brain stem from the medulla up to the diencephalon. And the nerves are coming out. They come out of the brain stem or the spinal cord. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, one thing that impedes us, and, you know, we had some good talks about emotions and everything, and, you know, Stephen Hansen had his ideas on emotional processing, which was very interesting. And also I was speaking about suppressed emotion and things like this, and conflict. And this is all centered around the limbic brain. And so I've got some ideas. I think balancing the limbic brain is important, because, and emotion, because that is what impedes you. If you want to be enlightened and be in this wonderful state of being, you have to get beyond the limbic system, the limbic system, yeah. And this is a picture, I mean, I don't know, someone gave this to me when I was a student. I don't know where it comes from, but it's just so great, because it shows you the structures of the limbic system stripped with all the cortex and other things that are not part of it stripped away, but so you can see it's shown. And so these areas, you've got these nuclei, they like the amygdala, hippocampus, the septum. There's quite a few here, septal mammary bodies, olfactory bulb. And then, of course, you've got the parts of the cortex are limbic as well. The word limbic actually means rim, so that's pretty cool. But I'll put this together, you know, as just a list of things of limbic brain function. And so when you're working with the limbic brain, because remember, if you want to balance people on this spiritual path, you've got to get them over their emotions first, because, you know, if someone's getting bogged down by their emotions, you know, or they're having problems processing emotions, like Steve was talking about last week, you know, the limbic brain can actually stop you. And so one of the things the limbic brain does is what I call the decision to be emotional. So what happens is, normally information comes in through your sensory systems, and your limbic system gates the information, reviews it, and if it feels like there's something, could be a threat, or it could be this, or it could be that, it decides, oh, that's dangerous. So that's a decision to be emotional. It's a decision that happens in the amygdala. The amygdala says that's dangerous, and so it's decided for you to be emotional. And like, you could even be having a talk with someone who you're, you know, and you get upset in a talk. And so when balancing emotions, a goal you could use is, I choose to be in control of my emotions, or I'm able to live free of emotion and not have your emotions run you. How many people have ever felt that you've had your emotions run you? Like, someone might say something, or, you know, a parent or a child or a partner or ex-partner might say something and it might really affect you. And then all of a sudden you get, oh, blah, 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 you know, but your brain's decided to be emotional. So you've got to control that and go, I choose to be able to process the situation without emotion, not let the emotion run. Subconscious emotions as well. My definition of a subconscious emotion is that you know you're emotional, but you don't know why you're emotional. And so it's kind of, you're out of control, and so you're feeling really angry at someone. because they've reminded you of something or something you don't know. So it's subconscious. You're aware you're angry, but you don't know why. And so this is really limbic brain. Also the ability to suppress emotions, which, you know, when you suppress emotions, it means you try and stuff it away and say, oh no, I haven't got time for this, let's do it later. So it's you know, suppressing emotions is like an avoidance strategy. It helps you avoid the emotion. And subconscious emotion helps you not being aware of what you want, not being aware of that you know, why you're emotional. So getting control of your subconscious emotions means you're able to control or understand why you're being emotional. Like, you know, I'm able to understand my emotions. People with a lot of subconscious emotions do not understand why they are emotional. And that's really important. Emotional expression, I mean, that's my domain. I do the Latino and I blow my top and blah. So it's about controlling outbursts, and, you know, you can be emotional, but, you know, you don't, you know, no one else has, you don't have the right to dump your emotions on other people. And when I say that, I need to look in the mirror. The other thing is interesting is about memory, because this gets around in the hippocampus and the amygdala is involved in that too. So short-term memory, they call it the phonological loop. It's just a little loop in your brain. It's like you have to rehearse it. It just keeps going round and round and round. And if you don't have a reason to remember it, you lose it. But if the amygdala says, oh, that's important, you put it away into your long-term memory. So, but you still need the limbic brain to form the memories, and especially the autobiographical or episodic memory, long-term memory. That's the memory you have of your own experiences, and also the long-term memory retrieval, like actually remembering things you did or where you put something. Like yesterday, I've been moving a lot of furniture. Yesterday, I put something down, and today I thought, oh, where did I put that? I couldn't find it. I mean, just because I moved everything in the house, I mean, but, you know, I couldn't remember where I put it. My amygdala decided it wasn't that important, but I think it is. And that's conflict, emotional conflict, which I didn't mention before. And that's the conflict between your conscious and subconscious. So my brain might think that's important, but your subconscious, Hugo, the coconut button does not matter. But it does. Like, if I lose a button on my shirt, what do I do? So this is the limbic format. It's interesting, and so you use anatomy gland 24 and 23. So just to explain where this came from, you know, I was very fortunate back in the when I did training in my initial training in kinesiology was in the mid-90s, and I learned with Charles and Richard Utt. And so CV24 was always central vessel and cortex, but the CV23 to use for the limbic brain actually came from someone in applied kinesiology, and Richard somehow picked it up at that point, CV23. You can use for the limbic brain and 24 for the cortex. And so he put them on together, 24 and 23, with anatomy and then added anatomy and gland mode. There are various ways he did it, but now they're all generally put on together, and but it wasn't always like that. And so that was kind of interesting because, you know, when I graduated from kinesiology school, I was very kind of inquisitive. I'd sit and watch things, and so this limbic format came out of applied physiology, which was information gleaned from applied kinesiology. Then what I did is, I was at what would you call it, a $2 market in Balnarring and on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria, if anyone knows where that is. I point to you if you know where Balnarring is. And so I was at this market, and there was a $2 nervous system book, Candle and Schwartz. And so after much debate, internal debate, I bought it. And I was looking through the pictures, and I was looking at the pictures of the brainstem. And then I realised I could format them, because CV24 is the alarm point, and 23 was using 26 and then the other points. And that's how I got the initial formats for all the brainstem, which I then sent to Charles. And he incorporated them into Leap. And now they've become a very... like a staple of kinesiology. I call them the primary formats. You know, and I want to talk about the Diencephalon, which is one of these areas, because you can see here the Diencephalon is the top of the brainstem, and so the brainstem and the spinal cord are to do with governing vessel, where up here you've got the cortex and limbic system to do with central vessel. So the Diencephalon is made, the main areas of the Diencephalon are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland, or here they call it the epithalamus. Or, hypophysis it's called as well. Hypophysis is another name for the pituitary gland. But what's interesting, and even though the Diencephalon is like the cap on the brainstem, it actually controls the cortex. And this is what the Diencephalon looks like. And so you can see it looks like, I don't know what that looks like. But these are all the different nuclei. And there is, up here you've got a picture of the cortex. And the reason that they're coloured like this is, say this green is connected to this part of the thalamus, this yellow, this part, orange, that part, this, that part, there, that part. And so you see how the colours match. And so now the other important areas to note here, this white here is called the lamina of the thalamus, because it's a lamina. But there's these little nuclei in there. They're called the intralaminar nuclei. And they have turned out to be really important. I'll explain that to you in a minute. And then over here, we've got this thing that you can't, it's only a piece of it, but it wraps right around the thalamus. It's called the reticular nucleus of the thalamus. So what we're going to find out is that these are really important. Most of the nuclei are called the relaying nuclei because they relay information from anywhere, and a lot of it's sensory information, to the cortex. And so, but it's actually controlling the cortex. And so it seems like, it's like the thalamus is like this central control mechanism where the cortex is a supercomputer, but the central control needs to send to the supercomputer, I want you to process this information and bring it back to me, please. And that's what it's like. So we think the cortex is all great and powerful and wonderful, and humans have got these massive cortices and it makes us so smart. You know, it's amazing how smart we think we are. But it's the thalamus that's actually controlling it. And that's kind of interesting. So it is a relay nuclei. The intralaminar nuclei are kind of important. The reticular nucleus, these are the ones I want to focus on because these are the ones I've found out there are important for consciousness. So the intralaminar nuclei, first of all, they're part of the ascending reticular activating system. So what does that mean? Well, the ascending reticular activating system creates this alertness and awareness with your brain. So it comes from down in the brainstem, so it drives up through to your cortex so you can be conscious and aware. Now, if there's a bilateral lesion in the intralaminar nuclei of the thalamus, that means they're knocked out. And there was this case of this woman who was a average woman, blah, 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 living her life, and then she just dropped into a coma like that, never came out of it. ever. And when after she died, they did an autopsy. She had a bilateral lesion. That was all she had wrong in the intralaminar nuclei. So there's no awareness or consciousness. And I think when neuroscience, what they do, so they say, oh, this is where consciousness exists in the brain. Well, I would call it awareness, because awareness is like a physiological thing of how aware you are of something. But if you can have limited levels of awareness and not be, like, you're not aware of your true nature, or you might be aware that, I don't know, today's Wednesday, you might be aware. I mean, I have to be aware of today's Wednesday. If not, I won't be here talking to you. Do you know what I mean? But, you know, so that's awareness, where consciousness is just that state. So I think the journey of enlightenment is about how aware are you of your state of consciousness, which is the truth. So the, you know, when they say that the intralaminar nuclei is to do with consciousness, I think it's more to do with awareness, because you become aware of your true nature. And, you know, and so, you know, and that's like in neuroscience, they're always looking for people who work with consciousness. It's like they're trying to find, you know, nucleus consciousness, you know, the consciousness nucleus, you know, the nucleus that gives you consciousness. Of course, it's not, you know, I don't see it as that. My opinion, which is just an opinion, you know, because working in a more spiritual kind of area, is that the brain is a mechanism of your consciousness. And so it interfaces in the thalamus, and specifically the intralaminar nuclei. So if they're not working, your consciousness can't interface with your brain, and then you have no awareness. Okay. The reticular nucleus, on the other hand, is kind of interesting, because it sits around the thalamus here, where the intralaminar nuclei are in there. And what that does, it's one of only two places in the brain we have GABA, the neurotransmitter, projecting from one nucleus to another. And that's really amazing, because usually it's just a sort of interneuron just within the area modulating information flow, and specifically the timing of information. So the information, basically it clears the noise out of the signal in the brain. So what GABA does is takes the noise out of your information flow, which is glutamate, and so you get your a clear information traveling around your brain, and that's what you want. Also, this is interesting, is the slow wave sleep or deep sleep. There's a mechanism when you're sleeping, you have cycles. So a sleep cycle is one episode of slow wave sleep and one episode of dreaming sleep, or they call them non-REM sleep and REM sleep. And REM means rapid eye movement. And your rapid eye movement is where all your dreams actually are generated from them, because they activate your visual cortex. And so what happens is when you have this slow wave sleep, in this deep sleep, it's actually the slow waves begin in the reticular nucleus of the thalamus. So you can see here, they begin here, then they come in here and they inhibit the thalamus. And when you inhibit the thalamus, it shuts down the cortex, because as the thalamus is a relay nucleus, the cortex has this massive input of glutamate going from the thalamus to the cortex, which is all the information flow. And so what happens is when you go into these, you know, when you cut out the GABA projection into the cortex, your cortex completely shuts down. So, you know, without the thalamic input, your cortex doesn't do anything. It just completely shuts down. And so when you have deep sleep, that's what happens. And so these things here we're going to talk about in a minute, and it's not just random I'm talking about this, because this is part of my hypothesis of consciousness. My son came and told me that the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. So I've got hypotheses, they're not theories. Good to know. So this is the Diencephalon format, and you can see that you've got here the governing 26, which is the alarm point, and 23. And then 24 was midbrain, and here was pons and medulla. Then you have brainstem, spinal cord, and it just like was a map on there. So we want to be able to balance the diencephalon and the limbic brain, because the limbic brain's like your resistance to consciousness, where diencephalon is your mechanism of consciousness. So when we're in the physical consciousness, or in the state of ignorance, as you can call it, which means we've got no idea of our true nature, your kundalini is dormant. You've got this physical consciousness, and it goes up to, as you start to become more spiritually aware. That's why I call that awareness. It's like awareness of your true nature. That is the journey of enlightenment, is becoming aware. So you start here with a physical, you raise up to the awakened consciousness, start becoming more aware until you get to the enlightenment. But coming back the other way is when we've got the formation of matter, is that we start with the, first there was the word, and the word became God. There was Om, in Genesis. It's just like you've got the void of undifferentiated consciousness, or nothingness, nothing. It just is. There's no perception of the self, because that's duality. But then there was a differentiation of consciousness down to the monadic plane, and monad actually means soul, and that's good, because in India they call the soul Jivatman, which means the individual flame, and where the oneness was called Paramatman, which means all. And so this is duality. It's the level of the soul. So it's a formation of duality. So consciousness differentiates into duality. So duality is here, like this is samadhi, this is pre-samadhi. And then as it comes down into the physics dimension, which is the forces, spiritual will, then the Buddhic is the archetypes, and archetypes are patterns of behaviour. And then from there, you've got the unconscious and conscious and subconscious, and that all comes down through your limbic, reptilian brain and your neocortex. And so you have different levels of understanding of your issues or problems. And so you can have them, you can have conscious emotions, subconscious emotions, and unconscious emotions. So duality is interesting. It's everywhere around you. And here, just some things. The initial differentiation. In India, it's Ida and Pingala. They're the yin and yang principle. In the Kabbalah, you've got Bina and Chokma, and Keta is one. So this is one duality. Yin yang, the twin dragons, twin snakes, is actually the same thing. And then you've got in Adam and Eve. I find Adam and Eve interesting, because Adam and Eve, it's basically yin and yang, but represented as people. And then, so they were living their yin and yang in harmony, in complete bliss. Then the apple and the snake actually represents, the apple represents, forbidden knowledge, or, it's temptation. That you're tempted to stray from that state of oneness. And so when they did that, when they succumbed to temptation, and that's the yin and yang principle. It's not, there was no like garden with two people. They represent the yin and yang principle. They represent the duality within us. And then they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden represents a state of enlightenment. So they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And then it was all about, how do I get back to the Garden of Eden? And that's a journey of enlightenment. Then they've got this thing called the 3 pillars. I thought that was kind of cool. You know, you've got over here, you've got the 3 nadis of Kundalini, Sushumna, Ida, and Pingala. You've got the 3 columns here of the Kabbalah, and even in Christianity, you've got the 3 wise kings who represent those 3 pillars. And they're kind of a foundation for the existence in the physical world. Even in India, the lingam is the yin-yang. It's got 2 focal points, and that's what it represents. Also supposed to represent the male sex organ, and they have the yoni as well, but it actually is a representation when you get beyond the whole male-female idea, or the whole male-female paradigm. So you can see you've got these 2 focal points, and they represent duality, yin-yang. And then so have you got sperm and egg. And so when you have conception, you've got yin and yang. And then you get the mixing, forming one cell, and then they divide. And then when you have conception, and I spoke about this last time with the yin, their conception is the Ida and Pingala, and these are your out-of-body chakras. And they contain imprints that come in here, you know, your karma, your archetypes, your samskaras are all imprinted into this first cell. Then here's a picture of the first cell and the first chakra, which is the placental chakra, which I spoke about before. And this is what I call the yin-yang of conception. So that actually looks like the first cell. So what you see here when your first cell, because Ida is yin, Pingala is yang, Ida comes with the ova, Pingala comes with the sperm, they form one, and Ida and Pingala is formed later on. Remember, if we looked at these pictures here, you can see Ida and Pingala are these, you know, then become these 2 serpents intertwined between all the chakras. But initially at conception, they're just small. I mean, it's just one cell. Ida and Pingala, you've got Sushumna here and the placental chakra. So what else does it look like? It looks like DNA. And so you can see that DNA, the twin dragons and the twin serpents of Kundalini all look the same. And so let me tell you a little story while you focus on the DNA GIF. Is that, you know, I remember I bought this book. It was by Jeremy Narby. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but Cosmic Serpent, I think it was called. And he was a anthropologist and was in the West Amazon basin in Peru. And he spent time with some of the indigenous people and the shamans, and he took ayahuasca and everything like this. And he was studying their spirituality. And it's kind of interesting because they have the twin serpents. They just call them tree snake and water snake. But that's how they're represented. Obviously, water snake is yin, tree snake is yang. And then, you know, when I was reading, I thought, oh, that's Kundalini. That's what it means, Ida and Pingala. It's the duality of it. But what he came to understand was that the DNA actually emits biophotons. And so all DNA-based forms of life can communicate with each other through biophotons. And it's where you've got the non-coding DNA, which are called tandem repeats, because they've got a periodic crystalline structure, which means they're good for holding information. And so that's what, you know, he had. And I was like, oh my God, that means the DNA is like Kundalini of the cell. It's like cellular consciousness is in the DNA. And it's why, it explains why, you know, if you talk to a shaman from South America and they can say, oh, that plant, you know, I had a friend who, he would take me into the jungle and he'd just start talking about which plants would cure which disease, and he reckoned he could cure any disease he could think of with his medicines. You know, I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what he would claim. And so that, but what they're describing is that the shaman has the ability to communicate with the plant, and that because we're all plants, humans, we're all DNA based. The hypothesis would be, hypothesis would be that we actually we communicate with all life forms through our biophotons from the DNA, and we can hold that information. And it's just that when you're under the influence of a hallucinogen, such as ayahuasca, which has got DMT in it, you can actually get access to that, and you can see that, and which you can see the biophotons and the information exchange between all DNA-based forms of life, if you understand what I mean. I think that's pretty interesting. So the enlightenment, the great void, Samadhi in India, communion with God, the Garden of Eden, it's the Tao, it's the mind of God, and so on and so forth. You know, before I went to live in India, and I used to hang out with these Native Americans down in Melbourne, and which was important for me because my grandfather was Native American from South America, and so I've always connected with that, and I wanted to understand it, and they called it great mystery. And I love that. I thought, great mystery, that's what it is. I mean, we don't understand it. We try to understand it. We write books and, you know, people found religions and everything, but no one really understands it. Great mystery, perfect. So, and so through all of this was then I came across the information about DMT. And so DMT is a molecule derived from tryptophan, just like serotonin is. And so this is kind of interesting because DMT actually binds to serotonin receptors. So I said it. So this is tryptophan, and see this is the indole group. You can see there's a carboxylic acid group, and there's an amine group that makes it an amino acid. All amino acids have to have this, or they're not an amino acid. Kind of find it interesting how people call taurine an amino acid. When you look at it, okay, it's not an amino acid. So what happens is when you make tryptophan, the first thing you do is you make 5-hydroxytryptophan. So this is a hydroxy group, and this is the 5th carbon. So basically what they're saying is this 5th carbon here gets hydroxylated instead of a hydrogen, basically gets an OH group. Then you have to get rid of the carboxylic acid group. You can see it's missing here. So that's called decarboxylated. So it's hydroxylated, then decarboxylated, and there's serotonin. DMT, on the other hand, you notice there's no hydroxy group, so it doesn't become, and this is called 5-hydroxytryptophan, or 5-HT. And then when it gets rid of the carboxylic acid group, it's called tryptamine. So this is 5-hydroxytryptamine. So DMT, on the other hand, it doesn't get hydroxylated, but it gets made into tryptamine, which means it gets the carboxylic acid group. Then it gets methylated twice, and to get dimethyltryptamine. That's why it's called dimethyl, because there's 2 methyl groups on it. And so you can see these are the 2 pathways of tryptophan that happens in DMT. Happens in the pineal gland. So dimethyltryptamine, it's actually, we can produce it, and I have proved and found the enzymes, we have them, we have the genes for them. So we definitely have the capacity to make DMT. Absolutely not question. So first of all, it's converted to tryptamine, which is the decarboxylated form of tryptophan, and then it's methylated twice. Its active hallucinogenic ingredient of ayahuasca is DMT, very similar to psilocybin, has a similar effect, but it's a different molecule. So dimethyltryptamine, but because it's actually derived from tryptophan, we break it down quickly. But when you get ayahuasca, they actually, as part of the brewing, they actually, in the substance, make enzyme inhibitors. So what happens is that when you take ayahuasca, the DMT doesn't wear off quickly. It stays around for a long time. But DMT binds to serotonin receptors, and you can see it's kind of a similar shape, so it's not surprising. It's just missing the hydroxy group, and it's got 2 methyl groups. And it binds to the 1A, 2A, 2C, and the 4. They call them the 5-HT, and the 5-HT comes from 5-hydroxytryptamine. That's why it's called 5-HT. Okay. So I became very interested in the 5-HT4 receptor. So this became the basis of the NK balancing. And, you know, this was a long time ago, and I'm reading this book. I read about this, you know, Rick Strassman's got his book on DMT, the spirit molecule. And I had to run out, and I went searching, and I found a book on serotonin receptors. I mean, who else would buy a book on serotonin receptors but me? And I read about it, and this is, you know, like what I was saying, there are high levels of the 5-HT4 receptor in the intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus. I'm going, what? That's where consciousness exists in the brain, according to neuroscience. There's high levels of 5-HT4 receptor, which means, you know, the DMT gives you the hallucinogenic experience. It's enabling you to see visions, have vision. And to have vision, you need your cortex activated, so it's going into the thalamus. And I'm like, wow, consciousness in the brain. We can just balance DMT on the 5-HT4 receptor, because I had formats for those. And so this led to, and at the time when I was writing this, I had an acquaintance of mine, and he did all these high-level meditation, and I went round there and I was explaining it to him. I was like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And he's like, hey, yeah, man, that's really cool. What, can you give me that balance? I'm like, oh, okay, I should try it. But because this person did a lot of samadhi meditation, I was doing the balance on him, I was holding the points, and he went into this deep state, and I went into a deep state, and I just did this balance, and he came out and he goes, oh, that was a cool pre-samadhi. What about samadhi? I'm like, what? I thought I'd discovered the Holy Grail, you know, and it was like, no, it was just like, it was like the bowl the Holy Grail was washed in. It wasn't the Holy Grail. I was like, oh, damn. But the next thing was interesting. It leads to long-term hyperpolarization. What does that mean? So it's inhibition of hyperpolarization. So depolarization is when a neuron fires. Hyperpolarization is when it shuts down, stops firing. If you inhibit hyperpolarization, you keep the neuron in its firing state. And it's due to the inhibition of calcium channels, not calcium, potassium channels. And this causes long-term neural excitability, which basically forms plasticity in the brain. And we might have heard of brain plasticity before, but it's the ability of the brain to make new connections and create new networks. It's like the ability to learn. And so, oh my God, so you've got these really long-lasting serotonin receptors in the intralaminar nucleus where DMT binds to, and in the thalamus that controls all our sensory experience. And that's where we're having this like spiritual experience. And I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. And it became the basis of the consciousness balance. So, you know, some of the other things are kind of interesting because it's also involved in cognition, learning, memory, emotional processes and reward. And so I was talking about all these emotions before, but it's very important that not just having a spiritual experience like I take ayahuasca, I'm enlightened, you know. They're also found extensively in the hippocampus where you've got learning memory. So also modulate the cholinergic system, which is important for the acetylcholine. And in Alzheimer's disease, there's a significant loss of the 5-HT4 receptor. And in the basal ganglia as well. So that is pretty interesting, I thought. I don't know what you thought, but I thought that was. So then I came up with this pre-Samadhi balance. If you want the full thing, do my NEPS 3 course, Neural Emotional Pathways 3, where I've got the whole consciousness balance. And I know there's some people out there that have probably even taught it. You know, it's really, really great balance, that. And also there's one in the hormone course as well. Okay, so we're going to do, because the diencephalon is governing vessel, so we use the Terry's major muscle tests. We use the diencephalon format, and we do hormone mode and dimethyltryptamine and the receptor for the 5-HT4 receptor. So we want to do these in and then constantly testing Terry's major and correcting as necessary. So anyway, you know, I was at my friend's place in California, you know, hippie from the 60s, and he's like, you know, I had this whole idea of you know, the serotonin receptors, DMT, consciousness. Like, I mean, this was the consciousness balance. We could balance people's brain so they don't have any stress in it when they're trying to spiritually develop themselves. That would be the significance of them. I thought, to me, that was huge. And it's honestly one of the most important, for me, as a balance I've used, is probably the most balance I've ever done. But I said to, I'd given it my best shot. I did all my big spiel. I went and did a balance, and he just came out of the balance. He goes, "Hey man, that was a cool pre-Samadhi. What about Samadhi?" And I'm like, "Oh, what? I thought I had it. That was it." And I go, like you have these ideas, and I think one of the, important things about really, if you really want to get ahead in the world, is ability to self-reflect on mistakes you've made and what errors you've done. So when he said to me, "What about Samadhi?" And I'm like, I know how that works. It just, what happens is, like, it's really amazing. I look at something, it's like a thought appears in my brain, and it's a complete map of how it actually works. And I realised it was the GABA in the reticular nucleus, because in REM sleep, non-REM sleep or deep sleep, the cortex shuts down. And it's mediated by an internal physiological mechanism. So when we go from REM sleep to non-REM sleep, we go cycle. And when we go into non-REM sleep, there's a mechanism that activates the reticular nucleus of the thalamus. That shuts down the thalamus. And then the cortex loses its thalamic input, so it shuts down too. But samadhi is only possible through spiritual development and raising kundalini. It's beyond duality. And so if there was to be a physiological mechanism for samadhi or that state, it would have to involve the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, but it wouldn't be an internal physiological mechanism like our sleep cycles are. It would be just a mechanism triggered by your spiritual development. So then we've got the samadhi balance, and so now we're going to use the neurotransmitter GABA, because the GABA, if you remember, go back and look at that previous slide. Come back here. You see the reticular nucleus, you've got the GABA projections into here. So if this gets activated and the GABA projections start going in here, they shut it down. Just shuts down. Then you lose your cortical. All this shuts down because you've lost this. And then you're in samadhi. And so that would have been my, you know, when he said, hey, cool, hey, man, that was cool. What about samadhi? You know, I was kind of a moment shocked, and all what I just explained to you just flashed through my mind, and I thought, oh yeah, I know how to do that actually. So I did it on him, and he actually went into samadhi and went into these really deep samadhi state. So it's kind of interesting. So so you've got this other balance where you can use, a bit like the DMT balances, called the GABA balance. So instead of doing DMT, you're doing GABA. And the GABA receptor, and still the Diencephalon. So I hope all of you have enjoyed my talk this evening, and see you again next time. Thank you.